Welcome to this class. Today we will discuss Gayatri Chakravorty's spivak. Can the subaltern speak? So let's start. Let's begin. The original text of Gayatri Chakravorty's spivak. Can the subaltern speak? Some some of the most radical criticism coming out of the West today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of the West or the best as subject. The theory of pluralized subject effects gives an illusion of undermining subjective sovereignty while often providing a cover for the subject of knowledge. Although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and jealousy of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. This subject curiously sewn together into a transparency by denegations belongs to the exploits side of the international division of labor. It is impossible for contemporary French intellectuals to imagine the kind of power and desire that would inhabit the unnamed subject of the other of Europe. It is not only that everything they read, critical or uncritical, is caught within the debate of the production of that other, supporting or critiquing the constitution of the subject as Europe. It is also that in the constitution of that other of Europe, great care was taken to obliterate the textual ingredients with which such a subject could connect, could occupy, or invest its itinerary, and only by ideological and scientific production, but also by the institution of the law in the face of the possibility that the intellectuals is complicit in the persistent constitution, otherwise the self-shadow. A possibility of political practice for the intellectual would be to put the economic under erasure, to see the economic factor as irreducible as it is reinscribed the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant or the transcendental significant. The clearest available example of such epistemic violence is the remotely orchestrated, far-flung, and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. This this project is also the asymmetrical obliteration of the trace of the other in its precarious subjectivity. It is well known that Foucault locates epistemic violence, a complete overhaul of the episteme in the redefinition of sanity at the end of the European 18th century. But what if that particular redefinition was only a part of the narrative of history in Europe as well as in the colonies? What if the two projects of epistemic overhaul worked as dislocated and unacknowledged parts of a vast two-handed engine? Perhaps it is no more than to ask that the subtext of the palimpsestic narrative of imperialism he recognized as subjugated knowledge, a whole set of knowledge that have been disqualified as inadequate to their task or insufficiently elaborated naive knowledge located low down on the hierarchy beneath The required level of recognition or scientificity. This is not to describe the way things really were or to privilege the narrative of history as imperialism as the best version of history. It is rather an account of how an explanation and narrative of reality was established as the normative one. Let us know Let us now move to consider the margins. No one can just as well as say the silenced center of the circuit market out of its epistemic violence, men and women among the illiterate please be century. The tribals, the lowest strata of the urban subproletariat according to Foucault and Delusion, the first word under the standardization of regimentation of socialized capital, though they do not seem to recognize this. The oppressed, if given the chance, the problem of representation cannot be bypassed here and on the way to solidarity through alliance politics. As Marxist thematic is at work here can speak and know their condition, we must now confront the following question on the other side of the international division of labor from socialized capital inside and outside the circuit of the epistemic violence of imperialist law and education supplementing an earlier economic text can the subaltern speak. The first part of my proposition that the phased development of the subaltern is complicated by the imperialist project is confronted by a collective of intellectuals who may be called the subaltern studies group. The must ask can the subaltern speak here? We are within Foucault's own discipline of history with people who acknowledge his influence. Their project is to rethink Indian colonial historiography from the perspective of the discontinuous chain of peasant insurgencies during the colonial occupation. This is indeed the problem of the permission to narrate discussed by said as Ranjeet Guha argues. The historiography of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism, colonialist elitism, and bourgeois nationalism elitism, sharing the prejudice that the making of Indian nation and the development of the consciousness nationalism, which confirmed this process, were excessively or predominantly elite archives achievements in the colonialist and neo-colonialist historiographies. These achievements are credited to British colonial rulers, administrators, policies, institutions, and culture in the nationalist and neo-culturalist writing to Indian elite personalities, institution, activity, and idea. This was a clear remark or statement of Ranjit Guha. Now, another part of the text is started here. Certain varieties of the Indian elite are at best native informants for first word intellectuals interested in the voice of the other, but one must nevertheless insist that the colonized subaltern subject is irretrievably heterogeneous. Against the indigenous elite, we may set that Guha calls the politics of the people, politics of the people. Both outside this was an autonomous domain for it, neither originated from its light did its existence depend on the latter, and inside it continued to override vigorously in spite of colonialism, adjusting itself to the conditions prevailing under the Raj and in many respects developing entirely new strains in both form and content. The circuit of colonial production I cannot entirely endorse this insistence on determinate, bigger and full autonomy for practical historiography. Existence will not allow such endorsements to privilege subaltern consciousness against the possible charge that his approach is essential. Guha constructs a definition of the place of the place of that essence that can be only an identity in indifferential. He proposes a dynamic stratification grid describing colonial social production to at large, even at the third group on the list, the buffer group, as it were, between the people and the great macrostructural dominant groups, itself defined as a place of it uh, betweenness that Derrida had described as an entry entry to elite. Now elite dominant foreign groups, second part dominant indigenous group on the all Indian level, and dominant indigenous group at the regional and local level. Fourth was the term people and subaltern classes are used as synonymous throughout Guha's definition. The social groups and elements included in this category represent the demographic difference between the total Indian population and all those whom we have described as the elite. Consider the third item on this list, the entry of situational determinacy. These careful historians presuppose as they grapple with the question, can the subaltern speak? So this was a quotation or statement of Ranjeet Guha, which is to be read very clearly. But now we will left it and move ahead for the task of research projected here is to investigate, identify, and measure the specific nature and degree of the deviation of the elements constituting item from the ideal and situate it historically, investigate, identify, and measure the specific the elements constitute constituting from the ideal and situate it historically, investigate, identify, and measure the specific. A program could hardly be more essentialist and taxonomic. Yet a curious methodological imperative is at work. I have argued that in the Foucault deluge conversation, a post-representationalist vocabulary hides an essentialist agenda in subaltern studies because of the violence of imperialist epistemic, social, and disciplinary inscription. A project understood in essentialist terms must traffic in a radical textual practice of indifference, the object of the group investigation in the case not even the people as much of the floating buffer zone of the regional elite. Subaltern is a deviation from an ideal. The people are subaltern, which is itself defined as a difference from the elite. It is toward this structure that this research is oriented, a predicament rather different from the self diagnosed transparency of the first word. Radical intellectual what taxonomy can fix such a space whether or not they themselves perceive it. In fact, Guha sees his definition of the peoples within the master slave dialectic. Their text articulates the difficult task of rewriting its own conditions of impossibility as the conditions of its possibility. At the regional and local levels, the dominant indigenous group belongs to social strata hierarchically inferior to those of the dominant all Indian groups sected to the interest of the latter and in on the and not in the conformity to interest corresponding truly to their own social being. When these writers speak in their essentializing language of a gap between interest and action in the intermediate group, their conclusions are closer to Marx than to the self-conscious near of Deleuze's pronouncement on the Subuha. Like Marx speaks of interest in terms of the social rather than the libidinal being. The name of the father imagery in the 18th Brumaire can help to emphasize that on the level of class or group action, true correspondence to own being is as artificial or social as the patronymic. So much for the intermediate group marked in item 3 for the true subaltern group. Those identity its difference there is no unrepresentable subaltern subject that can know the speak itself. The intellectual solution is not to obtain from representation. The problem is that the subject's itinerary has not been traced as to offer an object of seduction to the representation to the representing intellectual in the slightly dated language of the Indian group. The question becomes how can we touch the consciousness of the people even as we investigate their politics? With what voice consciousness can the subaltern speak? Their project, after all, is to rewrite the development of the consciousness of the Indian nation. The planned discontinuity of imperialism rigorously distinguishes this project, however old-fashioned its articulation from rendering visible the medical and juridical juridical mechanism that surrounded the story of Pierre Riverica reference, and then Foucault is correct in suggesting that to make visible the unseen can also mean a change of level. Addressing oneself. Now it is the last paragraph, last page. Addressing oneself to a layer of material which had hitherto had no persistence of pertinence for history and which had been recognized as having any moral, aesthetic, or historical value. It is the slippage from rendering visible the mechanism to rendering the individual, both avoiding any kind of analysis of the subject, whether psychological, psychoanalytical, or linguistic, that is consistently troublesome. When we come to the concomitant question of the consciousness of the subaltern, the notion of what the work cannot say becomes important in the semiosis of the social text. Elaborations of insurgency stand in the place of the utterance. The sender, the peasant, is marked only as a pointer pointer to an irretrievable consciousness. As for the receiver, we must ask who is the real receiver of an insurgency. The historian transforming insurgency into text for knowledge is only one receiver of any collectively intended social act with no possibility of nostalgia for that lost origin. The historian must suspend as far as possible the glamour of his her own consciousness or consciousness effect as operated by disciplinary training, so that the elaboration of the insurgency packed with an insurgent consciousness does not phrase into an object of investigation or worse yet a model of imitation. The subject implied by the text of insurgency can only serve as a counter possibility for the narrative sanctions granted to the colonial subject in the dominant groups. The post-colonial intellectuals learn that their privilege is us in this they are a paradigm of the intellectuals. It is well known that the notion of the feminine rather than the subaltern of imperialism has been used in a similar way within deconstructive criticism and within certain varieties of feminist criticism. In the former case, a figure of woman is at a is at issue one whose minimal predication as indeterminate is already available to the phallocentric tradition. Subaltern historiography raises question of method that would prevent it from using such a rouge for figure of women. The relationship between women and silence can be plotted by women themselves. Race and class differences are subsumed under that charge. Subaltern historiography must confront the impossibility of such gestures. The narrow epistemic violence of imperialism gives us an imperfect allegory of the general violence that is the possibility of an episteme. Within the effaced itinerary of subaltern subject, the track of sexual difference is doubtfully affected. The question is not of female participation insurgency are the ground rules of the sexual division of labor for both of which there is evidence. It is rather that both as object of colonialist historiography and as subject of insurgents, the ideological construction of gender keeps the male dominant. If in the context of colonial production, subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. So this is the end of this essay of Gayatri Chakrovorty Spivak and the subaltern speak. Friends, if this is uh, useful for you, please subscribe, subscribe and like my channel for such video. So dear friends, please like and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.